High above the icy waters of the Arctic Sea, nature flowed ever so carefully. However, deep below the freezing ocean waves, another, much more horrifying story was still being told. Inside of a 19,000-ton steel-cased underwater monster, a poison was quietly infiltrating itself deep into a submarine. On the morning of August 12, 2000, in the middle of the desolate Barents Sea, a single weld on a torpedo casing was leaking. The leak released a clear, odorless liquid called high-test peroxide, harmless to humans but very deadly when interacting with raw metal. And in a machine this dense and darkly powerful, raw metal was of clear abundance. The crew, who was unaware of this leak, opened the torpedo launch hatch to prepare for a scheduled military test shot, and placed the leaking torpedo inside of the shot compartment. The torpedo quietly leaked the HTP that slithered its way onto the copper and brass fittings inside of the compartment. When HTP touches raw metal, it decomposes violently, releasing gas, oxygen, and searing heat. And right away, just like clockwork, it reacted, expanding 5,000 times in volume before anyone can blink. The violent expansion ruptured the torpedo's close-by kerosene fuel tank, igniting a half-ton fuel explosion deep inside of the mechanical infrastructure. The explosion, which was supposed to be directed out to sea, now blew past the open hatch door and went inwards. The 7 crew members inside of the torpedo room were eviscerated instantly. Inside the torpedo room, 8 torpedoes sat in their launch tubes, and nearly 20 more lined the steel walls. Thankfully, the first explosion didn't actually detonate the stored torpedoes. Warheads are heavily armored and pressure-sealed, built to survive anything short of intentional detonation. But the fire did not stop. Fueled by the kerosene from the initial blast, it began to heat the compartment to dangerous levels. If the torpedoes continued to endure such heat, the structural integrity and stability would slowly begin to crumble. The fire needed to be contained, but everyone who could stop it was already dead. The explosion plunged the submarine into chaos. Darkness engulfed everything as the lights failed, pressure alarms wailed, and the fire tore through every line of fuel and wiring it could possibly find. Compartments 1 and 2 were a lost cause. Crews further back in compartments 3 and 4 may have scattered out and sealed their bulkhead doors to contain the spread of the hungry fire. Further back, the remaining crew might have been unaware of the full scope of the disaster altogether. I mean, it all happened so incredibly fast, and no one in the command center could even report what had gone wrong because they were all dead. Regardless, the front of the submarine was completely unsalvageable. The structural integrity had failed, and with nothing to stop the focused heat, the torpedoes were starting to warp, and the armor casings were softening. But by far the largest problem was that the command post was gone. The Kursk had lost control. And with flooding on top of loss of buoyancy control systems, the submarine began to sink fast. Back in the torpedo room, the internal temperature reached nearly 1,200 degrees Celsius. The kind of heat that softens and bends steel. The type of heat that lights air itself ablaze. But as the heat built, the liquid turned rapidly to gas, expanding tenfold in volume, pressing against the steel casings. Inside, the pressure built exponentially, gas forcing itself against walls that were never meant to bend. Gas that would normally drift with a light blow, now condensed with such force that, within milliseconds, it could tear through solid steel. And just 135 seconds after the first blast, the torpedoes ruptured under the pressure. An explosion equal to 4.5 tons of TNT tore through the torpedo room, and all that the crew could do was either die or listen as the explosion tore open a 25-meter wide hole in the hull of the dense steel plating on the submarine, obliterating 5 compartments and killing more than 60 men instantly. Of the 118 crew members on board, only 23 survived both explosions, and they were all crew members from the back compartments. Water now poured in from the front, and in a horrifying but foreseeable twist of events, the Kursk, already sinking from Explosion 1, finally reached some sort of resting point. The submarine had hit the sea floor. But it would be far too merciful if this is where the tragedy ended. Because while the 2 explosions killed most of the men instantly, the survivors weren't as lucky. The second explosion obliterated compartments 1 to 5 instantly. From compartments 6 to 9, a handful of men staggered through smoke-filled corridors, sealing bulkhead doors behind them in an attempt to stop the flooding. Some of the men were injured, and moving around in the cramped, tilted compartment was difficult, but everyone tried to stay calm. Captain Lieutenant Dmitry Kolsnikov gathered with the 22 other men in the 9th compartment, trying his best to comprehend the otherworldly predicament that they were in. After the explosion, the power was cut right away. The emergency lights flickered desperately, then died, and the temperature started to drop rapidly. In the Arctic Sea, a dead submarine acts as a refrigerator. The steel hull bleeds inside heat out to sea, and the compartment cools towards freezing temperatures. Above the sea, multiple Russian military ships and Norwegian seismic arrays detected the blast on their radars. You see, this submarine, the Kursk, was a part of a huge Russian Navy fleet, and it was on a practice mission before the explosion occurred. The practice mission aimed to test general submarine function, including, but not limited to, dummy torpedo test shots. Since an explosion was expected from this practice mission, when the blast rolled through the water, the other ships just assumed it was another drill. No distress signal was immediately released for the Kursk. Back inside, the men searched for anything that could help them. In the enclosed space, CO2 levels were rising fast. Carbon dioxide in high concentration is a silent poison, a poison that doesn't choke you right away. It confuses you first. Kolsnikov's first priority was very clear: oxygen for all the crew members. Very luckily, the 9th compartment came equipped with a handful of portable rebreathers and KO2 cartridges, a potentially life-saving find. But there weren't nearly enough for all 23 men, so they were forced to pass the rebreathers from hand to hand, taking turns breathing in the dark. The disorientation and panic of breathing in CO2 while desperately calling for your own turn of the oxygen rebreathers in the pitch-black room probably led most of the crew into extreme panic. Help needed to arrive fast. This oxygen wouldn't last forever. After some time, the other Russian Navy fleets began to assume radio failure, not yet realizing that a horrible disaster had taken place. Since there was no distress call received, they didn't seem to worry much. Unfortunately, due to the nature of the explosion in the front compartments, it wasn't at all possible for the men to send a distress signal to nearby radar. The only thing noted was the blast, but from the outside, nothing seemed unusual. Below the sea again, the men struggled. The symptoms of CO2 poisoning are nasty. It's a silent, disorienting gas. Every breath they took filled the room with more CO2, and the air grew thicker and thicker, almost oily. The horror of CO2 poisoning isn't that it's suffocating. It's confusing. It's like drowning in a fast-striking, thick fog, pulling you in before you even get a chance to realize. Kolsnikov takes an opportunity in this chaos to do something very important. He rummages around in the dark, searching for anything he can use. At this point, the room was likely freezing, and small amounts of water were leaking into the compartment, slightly filling the room. Nonetheless, after fumbling through the darkness for a bit, he manages to find a piece of paper and a pen, and begins writing. I am writing blindly. It's getting dark here to write, but I'll try by feeling. It looks like there are no chances, 10 to 20%. Let's hope someone will read this. Here are the people in the group. We feel bad, weak. We're getting weaker because of the effects of carbon monoxide. The pressure in the compartment is increasing. If we get out, we won't survive more than a few hours. From 13:15 to 13:30, we tried to get out, but it was impossible. I am writing blindly. The calmness in Kolesnikov's note, even under such unbearable circumstances, makes his declaration of probable death one of the most devastating written records of any ocean disaster ever found. The men waited patiently, but little did they know, absolutely nobody was coming to save them. The first and most crucial hours of the rescue mission were spent unaware that a disaster had even taken place. There was, however, one thing that might save them. You see, the place where these men were trapped, the 9th compartment, was one of only 2 sections on the Kursk equipped with an escape hatch. Right above the men, just a few feet away, was an escape from this nightmare. Obvious issues arose from this, however. Opening the hatch would likely drown most of the men, and even then, not only would they have to swim hundreds of feet to the top of the icy sea, rapid decompression from the ocean's weight would likely kill them instantly. As much as it was tempting, all of the men were forced to stay put, agreeing that it's better to wait for help from their comrades. The CO2 sickness continued to creep in, and after an agonizing 6 hours, the main Russian fleet finally began to suspect that the Kursk was missing. Rumors of a military attack circulated the Navy, and an hour later, search helicopters were deployed to locate the Kursk. Oil slicks were spotted near the initial exercise zone. They had found the general location. Upon hearing the news, the neighboring country of Norway immediately offered sonar support, but no international rescue alert was sent to NATO. Russian officials continued to describe the situation as a, quote, minor incident, giving almost no real details. To the outside world, the Kursk was simply just a missing submarine. Deep below, however, things were getting horrifying. The men began using the KO2 cartridges, small canisters in the compartment that now held a very important role. Each activation gave off heat, a faint hiss, and a glimmer of hope. Inside each cartridge, a compound called potassium superoxide reacts with the carbon dioxide in their breath, triggering an exothermic reaction that releases oxygen while absorbing the toxic CO2 around them. But it comes with a grave risk. If that reaction comes into contact with even a single drop of seawater, or if one cartridge is mishandled, it can ignite almost instantly. Under normal conditions, these systems are incredibly safe. But in the dark, surrounded by moisture, smoke, and exhaustion, every use of these cartridges becomes a gamble. They can save you, or spark a fire that devours the last breath of oxygen you have left. It's a deadly game of Russian roulette. Finally, after almost 10 hours, the Russian Navy initiated what they called a, quote, search phase. Rescue submersibles AS-32 and AS-34 were ordered to head towards the Kursk. But the submersibles were stationed hundreds of miles away and needed hours of preparation before they could even launch. Even at this stage, Russia still refused international rescue help and insisted that they had everything under control. Back inside the Kursk, the men were running out of options. The rebreathers were starting to fail. They now relied solely on the KO2 cartridges, passing them around rapidly to avoid hypoxia and CO2 poisoning. They have been doing this for almost 12 hours at this point, and things are starting to become absolutely horrifying. It's likely that due to the lack of oxygen and CO2 exposure, the men may have hallucinated or became incredibly delirious. As they continued to pass the cartridges, however, at some point in the chaos and darkness, one of the cartridges was dropped and slipped into the slightly flooded lower deck. The potassium superoxide inside reacted violently with the seawater, causing a flash fire in the compartment, scorching crew members, burning exposed skin, and consuming what little breathable oxygen remained in the small compartment. Around 1 a.m. the next day, roughly 14 hours after the explosion, the AS-34 submersible finally reached the Kursk and dived down. As it reached the Kursk deep below the sea, it strikes against the side of the hull. As it approached the wreck on the sea floor, it struck the hull unexpectedly and had to resurface due to damage. At that same time, deep inside Compartment 9, the men of the Kursk were likely taking their final breaths. Hours later, the Russian command center reports that they are still, quote, attempting contact. And for the next few hours of the cold night, in the 9th compartment room of the Kursk, 23 dead crew members lay silently in a cold, pitch-black steel tomb.
Don't say anything at this stage, Joe. So supposedly, so a little bit of that. It's not just got no holes or anything, there's no orifice.
It was rumored among the Russian media after the crash that one of the notes from the engineers aboard had written something along the lines of, quote, "Nobody is to blame," when writing to loved ones that may see the message. While there's no real proof of this letter existing, it holds a pretty deep significance. The reality of the situation here is that 23 men took their last breaths dying silently while believing that a huge fleet of people were rushing to save them. However, above the waters, that same fleet is paralyzed by bureaucracy, pride, and fear of embarrassment.